Interesting. Now let's go to one of the major stories we're having for you today. Violence against women happens in every country and in culture, causing harm to millions of women and girls. Risk and challenges to access care increase even more for women and girls living in humanitarian emergencies around the world. Today, prolonged and intense conflicts have resulted in a continuous rise in all forms of gender-based violence. The 16 days of activism against gender-based violence is a key international moment to call for an end to violence against women and girls.
The EU-funded three-day conference organized by the Rule of Law and Anti-Corruption Program and the Ministry of Justice Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Response Unit focuses on access to justice for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. The discussions on seeking justice for survivors identify three approaches: survival, perpetrator, and a whole society approach.
I think you have to look at justice holistically. You do not want a situation where somebody who is innocent is going to jail for a crime that they have not committed. And you also don't want a situation where somebody who has been wronged, for whom a crime has been committed against, doesn't get justice for that crime that has been committed against them. So I think you have to look at it from both sides. How can we enable a justice system that is fair? A justice system that allows everybody, rich, poor, old or young, educated or not educated, how do we enable a justice system that looks after everybody's needs?
Justice is that which downplays emotion, very, very objective intervention, prioritizing the needs of the survivor, and ensuring that every component of the society also benefits from justice to the victim. And that includes justice to perpetrators and justice to the entire society.
In her paper presentation, Titilola Vaivo Adeniyi admonished responders and service providers on best practices for survivor-centered approaches.
The term survivor-centered is used to convey a commitment to providing services that prioritizes their needs, their rights, their interests, confidentiality, and autonomy of the recipient of those services. It recognizes that they are the experts of their life. We are there to support.
ROLAC promises continued support for state and federal government on criminal justice initiatives and reforms that will enhance access to justice, not only for survivors of SGBV, but for everyone unlawfully arrested. Moya Thomas, TVC News, Abuja.
And I'm joined in the studio by Projects Manager, Access to Justice, ROLAC Program, Oluwatoyo Sigiwa. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.
This is a conversation that is very, very critical, very germane at this particular point in time. You look at, sexual and gender-based violence, what it meant, But let's just first look at it before we now dwell into the specifics, what gender-based violence means in general for the audience.
Well, basically, gender-based violence is violence that is committed against someone because of their gender. Basically because of their gender, because they are male or because they are female, or because of the cultural and social norm or normative attribution to their gender role. That's basically what sexual and gender-based violence is. And of course, statistics and data has shown over the years, over decades, that it disproportionately affects women and girls, basically because of the power dynamics in the society, especially in Africa, where a lot of people put a lot of stock in religion and cultural attitudes and norms.
I think we should start from that business, culture and religion, which has also kind of stifled that part where people can't talk about it, and there's that issue of if you talk about it, something, what happened. How do we navigate that part where people can actually come out and say, this happened to me at this particular, and you will not be stigmatized for it?
Well, what I will admit is that it's a gradual process. As society grows and advances, here in Nigeria, all over the world, people need to get more comfortable talking about the difficult issues. The unfortunate thing about sexual and gender-based violence is that it's one of those insidious crimes, usually done in the dark, usually done in secret, and therefore the perpetrator tends to hold the victim to ransom because they know that society frowns and ascribes some level of shame, guilt, responsibility, and blame on the victim rather than the perpetrator or the person who has committed the crime. So it is the secrecy that is associated with sexual and gender-based violence that keeps survivors or restrains survivors. They feel that they cannot report what has happened to them and get sympathy. They do not trust that the system or society will protect them. They do not trust that the system or society will believe them. And what we need to be doing is to remove that cloak of secrecy. We need to remove that cloak of shame or guilt, that burden of shame or guilt that society has placed on the survivor. We need to start lifting it up by talking about it, by not stigmatizing the people who come forward, and by not turning away those people who approach the system for help.
You know, there have been stories of where children try to talk and the parents try to shut them down. Do you think that there needs to be a punishment for that?
Of course, but what I will first say is that we need to also recognize that the same shame and guilt that society has placed on survivors, parents and family members, intimate partners, spouses, friends, they are also existing within that ecosystem, and they too bear some of the burden of the shame and guilt. But that said, in Lagos State, for instance, it is an offense. And within the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, it is an offense to aid or abet or try and cover up a sexual crime.
So let's look at some of the pointers and things to look out for when it comes to gender-based. What are the things that we need to look? What are the pointers we need to look at?
There are different forms of sexual and gender-based violence. There's the physical violence, sexual assault, where there's physical violence involved. There is what we call, in many of the variations of the Violence Against Persons Prohibition law, what you call defilement, which is basically child rape. There is economic violence, there is forced isolation, there is economic deprivation, where you withdraw with resources intentionally from someone so that you compromise their ability to function effectively in society. And there is also intimate partner violence, there's domestic violence. There is, as we are advancing in the world and as everybody is more online, there is technologically facilitated sexual and gender-based violence. There is image-based GBV, which basically means GBV that is perpetrated in the online space, which is, of course, linked to cyber crimes. And as we evolve and begin to experience these new forms of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as the forms in which they now manifest, the experience of the survivors, we need to also be planning and ensuring that our response reflects the gravity of the crime, the nature of the crime, the space within which those crimes are perpetrated, so that we can respond effectively when it happens.
One aspect of this conversation that also led us to explore is, there's a conversation where when you talk about gender-based violence, what everybody seems to think is that you're talking about the women and girls, which is, of course, because to a large extent, they are the ones who are affected mostly, but there's also the boy who also witnessed that stuff, so how do we begin to, have this conversation? I was talking to somebody and I said that I think that we're trying to treat the branch instead of
the tree.
The tree
And
the roots. Because if you are saying that the woman should do this and do that, the person who committed the crime, you are actually, or the person who this thing has happened to, you are also neglecting, because that guy who has witnessed something of such will grow up. His mentality will change. How do we begin to have that conversation where the boy child is also effectively put into this conversation, to address this gender-based violence?
I think that conversation is already taking place. If you look at the data from across sexual assault referral centers across the country, in the states where they exist, you begin to see a rise over the past 10 years in the number of boys that are reporting sexual and gender-based violence against them. You begin to see a rise in the number of children, not just boys now, but notably boys. There's an increase, especially boys that are under the age of 13 years old. So your programming or your planning, policy making has to begin to recognize that, driven by the data that is available. And where there is no data available, you need to dig a little bit deeper. If you don't have the data, then you don't know how many boys are experiencing this. And that therefore means that you are not reaching the boys. And if you are not reaching the boys, it means your programming and your response will continue to be faulty, because you don't know how to respond to boys when they present with GBV. It is easy to figure out, because we've been doing that for decades now, to understand what a woman or a girl goes through and how she experiences and tries to heal from GBV. But there is less known about how men and boys experience and deal with GBV. And you find that in many of the places where help is available, some of the frontline staff, most of the frontline staff are women. And again, you want to begin to ensure that when men enter these so-called safe spaces, they have access to people that they can trust, who they think will understand what has happened to them and the peculiarity of it, because it's different for men and boys as it is with women and girls. So I think it's in the programming. It's been deliberate, a little bit more deliberate in terms of the thinking around what men and boys need. Both from the prevention side now, what do we need to be saying to men and boys? How do we ensure that men step forward a little bit more to protect and educate boys a little bit more? Not just around what amounts to GBV and how to avoid being a potential perpetrator, but also how to not to put yourself in a situation that you will become the victim yourself. Sure. And also in response, what exactly do men and boys need if they are victims of domestic violence, if they are victims of GBV? How do our schools respond? How do our police complaints desks respond? And how do sexual assault referral centers that we work with, how do they also respond effectively to men and boys? I
think you just take it out of my mouth, because that's where my next question is going. How do we begin to respond to all of these things? The statutory agencies who are given the authority to undo this kind of issues, are we seeing enough from them? The NGOs who are involved, is the awareness enough? Are they having that conversation with the agencies who are in charge? Is there a lacuna that needs to be bridged? Those conversations, are we having them, and how do we bridge them?
We are having those conversations, and I would say that we are not where we were 5 years ago. A lot of progress has been made. In 2013, there was only one sexual assault referral center in Nigeria. Today, there are 47 sexual assault referral centers across 22 states. There is progress. 5 years ago, I think we had just about 2 or 3 states that had judges that were designated to handle sexual offenses. Yeah. But now we have several states that have designated judges particularly to handle sexual offenses. 5 years ago, there was nothing like a national sexual offender database, or maybe 6 years ago. Now you have a national database of sexual offenders, as well as equivalent databases in multiple states. So there is progress. What we need is more of the same type of progress. We need more capacity building. We need investigators, those who are at the front line, who manage these reporting channels, to be trained. We need them to recognize that SGBV is a crime and not be influenced by their cultural or religious perceptions, and to recognize it for what it is. We need them to operate within the context of the existing and enabling legislation. We need stronger investigative protocols that will recognize survivors and the situation that they are in, recognize their trauma, and not re-traumatize them or make their healing process a little bit more difficult. We need to strengthen our prosecutorial procedures. And of course, when the cases get to court, the judges need to be aware that this is how best, in terms of best practice now, to handle and adjudicate cases of sexual and gender-based violence. So everybody needs to work together. It's not one agency or one sector. All of us need to be consulting, coordinating, monitoring, evaluating, and assessing what we're doing. And most importantly, we need to be talking to the survivors themselves. We need to ensure that we're getting feedback. How are they experiencing all of these justice channels? Are they effective? Where are the gaps? We need to be speaking with the people that we claim that we are trying to help and getting feedback that will, of course, inform improvements in the justice sector.
I want to ask you this, and this is very important. Tell us about the sexual assault referral centers and how they can be, how impacts. Just tell us.
So sexual assault referral centers basically are safe spaces that have been designed or established to respond to some of the gaps that we've already spoken about. The gap in reporting, availability of reporting channels, and the gaps in effective investigation and prosecution. So they are a safe space that offers services free of charge to survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, emergency medical services, trauma counseling services, support to navigate the legal system or the justice process, recognizing that these are the immediate things that a survivor will need if they have experienced a sexual assault. And overall, they ensure that there is confidentiality and that no matter what story the survivor has come with, no matter what their situation as they have described it is, they are believed and not judged for what has happened to them, and that they support the survivor to the point where they are now willing to engage with the justice process. Sexual assault referral centers are also a mechanism to ensure that if there is any report of child sexual abuse or defilement, that report goes immediately to the authorities, to the police, and to the State Ministry of Justice.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
It's a conversation that I really wish we can just have more, but our time is fast spent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.